Oh, I am good to go. All right. Hello, everyone. Sorry for this long delay. Hi, my name is Nathan Creel, and today I'm going to talk to you about best practices for crafting low and non-alcoholic beers. I'm going to ask that questions that be posted in the comments section, and I will address these at the end of the talk. So without further ado, let's get started. Yes, my name is Nathan Creel, and I represent Berkeley Yeast. We make ordinary yeast extraordinary. We are the engineered industry leaders in bioengineered yeast strains with new properties that benefit fermentation for brewers and beyond. We're headquartered in San Leandro, California, just south of Oakland. We just recently moved there, and if you're ever in the area, please let us know and feel free to stop by and take a tour of our new facilities. Company was founded in 2017, and our products focus on benefiting you by bringing consistency and scalability to your production, and also allow you to create premium products with less inputs that are more cost effective. My presentation outline today, I'd like to go over why we are focusing on low and non-alcoholic beer by giving you just a snapshot of some current trends, and then present to you some options for making low and non-alcoholic beer by either build outs with CapEx or drop-in solutions. And then move into how to design a recipe, so things you want to consider when you're going to pursue making a non-alc product. And then most importantly, things to be aware of for package stability, and that's reducing pathogen contamination and safety considerations. So not to scare anyone off, but we need to remember that we're now working with a new product production that has a high risk for pathogenic contamination and is different than making a full strength beer. So pursuing this requires us to be cognizant of the risks involved. The non-alcoholic space is a growing opportunity. In 2023, a survey showed that a third of Americans aim to drink less alcohol. And this is for a variety of reasons. It could be the health considerations, the COVID hangover. Many new young consumers opt for other options than alcohol, and a number of other things. And at the same time, the production of alcoholic products is low and or stagnant. So it's only growing at about 3% in the same year. Whereas the non-alcoholic space is growing 10 times more at 32%. And furthermore, in a separate survey, participants were asked, what is it about non-alcoholic beverages when you're consuming these do you miss most? And of course, the leading answer was the mood enhancing effects. So that euphoric, relaxing feeling that may be brought on with the consumption of alcohol. But other answers given were flavor and variety of choice. So two things that are missing in a non-alcoholic beverage. And then fourth, the sociability factor. So you may not feel like you're a part of the group if you're not consuming an alcoholic beverage. But what I'd like to focus on are the second and third answers given, which are the flavor and variety of choice. And you as a producer control this. But something else to control, as mentioned, is the pathogenic contamination. So as you're making a full strength beer, because of its environment throughout the production process, reduction of residual sugars, lower acidic environment, and presence of alcohol, a full strength beer, there have been no documented incidences with pathogens present. As you lower the alcohol content, a low alcohol beer, there have been documented incidences with pathogens, E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella, Clostridium. And then if you go even lower to a non-alc beer, there is an extremely high risk. And incidences are likely to occur. These statements were made by this author, Menz, out of Australia in 2009, and also included this graphic that I think paints a picture of what you're doing when you're brewing beer. And if you think about it, when you're going through the whole process, starting at the boil, when you boil your wort and you add hops and you lower your pH throughout fermentation, and the yeast are producing ethanol and carbon dioxide, and then you are forcing carbon dioxide into your final product, you're creating this gauntlet that makes it harder throughout the process for any pathogenic bacteria to survive. Now think about this. If you're producing a non-alcoholic beer, a lot of these steps are not present. And this is further shown in a follow-up paper by the same author in 2011, where the team took produced beer and then did a challenge study with both E. coli 0157H7 as well as Salmonella. But for ease of illustration, I'm only going to show E. coli here. And in a non-alc beer, as mentioned, remember that there is no alcohol present, so 0.5% or lower. So there's no ethanol present to inhibit the growth of bacteria. The pH tends to be a little higher, again, because there's no alcohol and perhaps less CO2 present. And with a higher pH, that creates an optimal environment for bacteria to grow. And at the same time, there's higher residual sugar present, which is food for bacteria. So the author showed this in the challenge studies, that with beer at different ABVs of alcohol, as the alcohol became less, from 5% to 2.7% and 0.5%, after about 15 days, the presence of that E. coli was able to grow exponentially. Also note that the survivability of the E. coli in this environment was able to be sustained after that amount of time. The pH in this left side graph of this beer is at a pH 4.3. Whereas on the right-hand side, the alcohol remained 0.5%, and the pH was changed. So as the pH increased from pH 4 to 4.3, 4.5, and 5.0, it created an environment more favorable for the E. coli pathogen to survive. So when you're considering producing a non-alcoholic beverage, it's important to have a low pH. So the legal limit for packaging is 4.6. Our recommendation is 4, or as low as your sensory can tolerate. As on top of that, and if you can make it additive, that's even better. A low pH as well as tunnel pasteurization. Thus far, tunnel pasteurization is an established method for producing a safe and stable product. And lastly, please do not consider putting a non-alcoholic beverage on tap. Even if there's a low pH and a pasteurized product, putting it on tap just invites high residual sugar, non-alcoholic product to be left in the tap lines, exposed to environment, and it's very difficult to keep clean and reduce pathogenic contamination. So there's a high risk, even if you think that you're producing a safe product, putting a non-alcoholic beverage on tap does have a high risk that may not be safe for the consumer. Moving along, so this slide lays out some methods for producing low and non-alcoholic beer. The first two rows are capital expenditure build outs options that can be done. And I'll go through each one of these, where there's the process with benefits and challenges of each. The bottom two are drop-in solutions or alterations to your current fermentation process. But first, the first method is a thermal or evaporative method. And this is where you would ferment out a full-strength product. And then after fermentation, there'd be a physical separation based on evaporating. Basically, you're going to distill off your ethanol. There's ways that you can do this by rectifying vacuum distillation. Benefits of this is that you could distill off all the ethanol and make a true 0.0% product. You would complete the fermentation as mentioned. The challenges to this is that in the evaporation process, you might be changing the flavor. So you could be degrading it. There could be flavor loss. You could be losing esters through your evaporation process. There's a high energy cost as well as capital expenditures required of installation of some of this equipment. And one thing to note is that if you are considering to take this route for producing a non-alcoholic beverage, there may be additional permitting, like getting a DSP license, that could have a high cost for entry. The second option is reverse osmosis or membrane filtration. This, again, is producing a full-strength product, but in the end, you actually physically separate out the products by passing it through, again, a membrane, or could be reverse osmosis where the ethanol is removed by a separate stream. This could be more gentle than thermal processes. However, it does have challenges much the same as a thermal or evaporative process where there would be flavor loss, energy costs. You're using a lot of water because you have to then replace that ethanol loss with water. And again, a high CapEx. The third option is arrested fermentation or cold contact. This is a short contact time where you are not fermenting your product for much longer than 2-3 days max. And so you're limiting the yeast ability to be able to ferment out the sugars that you provided from your mash and lauter steps. Benefits of this: low capital, so you're not really changing much in your process. There would be low flavor degradation and a lower need for, if at all, the removal of alcohol. The challenges to this is you may miss your targets. So it takes a lot of trialing to understand what your mash schedule would be, how your temperature and your time. Again, there may be water required to dilute your product if you happen to miss your target endpoint, if you happen to allow it to ferment out and you produce too much alcohol. There may still be Worty off flavors present because the yeast aren't allowed to complete the fermentation. And then there may be a lack of fermentation character. So there may not be that beeriness present that we are used to when we have a full strength beer. And there would be residual fermentables remaining in the final product that, again, from the previous slide, those residual fermentables could be food for any pathogenic contamination. The fourth option is using a low alcohol or non-alcohol yeast. And these are yeast strains that are unable to ferment maltose and maltotriose. Again, there's a low capital required, so it's a drop-in solution, and that's a benefit to a brewer. So there's no change in the process needed. In the capital expenditure needed. And there's a lot of non-alcoholic yeast entering the market recently, able to produce some of these beer flavors. There's no need to have to remove any. There's no flavor degradation process in alcohol removal process. The alcohol is kept at the alcohol production is kept at a minimum. But some of the challenges, much like the previous one with arrested fermentation, is that there could be warty off flavors still present in some of these non-alc products. And then also they may still lack fermentation character. And much like the arrested or cold contact fermentation, there would be residual fermentables that, again, could be food for pathogenic contamination. But with that, a good place to start in producing a low and non-alcoholic product would be to utilize a maltose negative yeast strain. We at Berkeley Yeast have these, where we have engineered yeast to not allow the uptake of maltose and maltotriose. So any produced in the mash and lautering process is not taken up by the yeast. However, yeast strains would still be able to uptake glucose, and the minimal amount of glucose produced would make a low level of ethanol in the process. Again, it's a low capital expenditure with high precision because of how these yeast strains are made and made available in the process. As mentioned, it would generate a low ABV, so 0.5% or lower, when you're starting with a low Plato, so around 6% Plato, which is far lower than what we're commonly used to when making a full strength beer, without additional dealkalization steps. The unfermentable maltose and maltotriose would enhance the body, giving it some mouthfeel, and may have a little bit of sweetness added. And the upside to this also is that the application is broad across many brewery designs. So if you have a brewery setup, then this could be applicable to you. Again, the strain, the attenuation of these are quite low, where your process in your mashing of having a low RDF at the onset during that you then send to the fermenter would not allow for a high attenuation. So that is kept low. And with this, there's all these options so that you could do to your product when producing a low and non-alcohol beer. So not only the yeast being able to produce some of these some flavors, and I'll get to that in a second. But going back to the survey where it was mentioned of what a consumer misses most in a non-alc beverage, flavor and variety of choice, this highlights again that you control this. So you have many options: sweetness, mouthfeel, body, foam. I could go around this whole slide. These are all options that you control. So you have all these levers to play with. So what is the first thing you want to think about when developing a recipe. Oh, and there's lots of opportunities here. First and foremost, we highly recommend that you perform a process review. Maybe consider utilizing a third-party source process authority that would come in and help you understand where possible microbial contamination could occur. You want to work to limit this, and you want to set out what your process is going to look like, limiting your touches, reduce and minimize movement around the brewery. So how many hoses are you going to use? How many pumps? And try to minimize tank transfer as well as distance. So if you had a shorter distance, it would be easier to have a more clean process rather than having far distance hoses spread across your brewery to move your product if needed. So that's the physical process review. Then recipe design. We recommend starting with a simple grist. So 100% two-row, something that's going to give you a foam positive mouthfeel, and then try to steer clear of utilizing crystal malt that can increase oxidative characteristics. And don't think so much about the color of the beer yet as a first pass. Worry about that in a secondary trial. And there are other options for adding color, which I'll get to later. When you are devising how much grain, aim for an RDF between 10 and 25%. This would be an original gravity between 5 and 8 Plato. The lower the gravity will allow you for a higher RDF. And then conversely, a lower RDF allows for you to have a higher gravity. If you have a lauter tun that has a wide surface area, you may need to consider utilizing rice hulls that will increase the mass so it covers the plates for you to have an efficient rinse or sparging of in your lauter tun. Utilizing hops, when you use hops on the hot side, they are true to type, but you may want to consider reducing those bitterness because you're going to have a lower Plato to start with. So you need to balance out just how bitter your product is going to be. And then the pros and cons, looking at this range of RDF. So if you aim for a low, let's say 10% RDF, you're going to have a low alcohol product. There would be more residual sugar present, and that's a downside, as well as a lower amount of sensory beer determinants. So you may have lower production of esters that would give you that beeriness, and at the same time, the beer may remain worty because it's not allowed to ferment out completely. However, the upside to this is that there would be no dilution or dealkalization required. The higher you go in your RDF, you might produce higher alcohol. So if you overshoot your target, you may have to dilute your product with water. The upside to that, though, is you would have less residual sugar because that gets fermented. There would be more beeriness. And to reiterate again, there would be dilution or dealkalization needed or diluting with a product. Doing so touches it as well as waters down your product. So there's a risk of contamination or producing a product that is not to the standard that you were maybe thinking you were going to obtain when you devised your recipe. And considering upfront how long you mash and at what temperature. I just want to point out really quick that we need to remember that the mash step is activating malt enzymes of mainly beta amylase and alpha amylase that are producing these sugars. So recall, beta amylase is making maltose, and alpha amylase is making random long chain dextrins from the starch that is present in the malted barley. And mentioning that, so when you go to mash, even though you may have a lower degree of fermentation, it is time and temperature dependent how much of this you would be producing. So you're aiming in a traditional high strength beer production, you're mashing between 149 and 154 Fahrenheit at a pH of 5.1 to 5.5. This red box shown here in the chart on the right hand side. And that's your mash target, doing a 60-minute infusion mash, for instance, to activate those two enzymes. But when you go to make a low and non-alcoholic beer, decreasing the time and or increasing the temperature will lower that RDF. So for example, you could look at it two ways, and these are some examples from trials that we've done in the field. You could mash in at 155, so slightly higher, and hold that for 10 minutes, and then immediately ramp up to 175. So you're not allowing those beta and amylases to produce many sugars for fermentation. Another approach would be to just strike in at 165 and then immediately ramp up to 175. So that beta amylase will have near zero opportunity to be active. The alpha amylase would be producing some long chain dextrins. There would be maybe some glucose produced, and then you would have you would be in your range of 10 to 25% RDF. Some other things to consider here in your mashing is the acidity. So you would have less tannic flavors in your runnings. The acidity would reduce your bitterness units and may add some fermentation character if you were to add some acid. However, too low of an acidity can affect your RDF in the fermentation. Moving from mash and lautering, in your kettle boil and your wool pooling, considering the use of hop flavors and bitterness, again, I had mentioned before that a lot of the hop addition would be true to form. So they would have similar flavor and aroma characteristics. But again, you would want to consider decreasing this by 20 to 60% because you're going to have lower RDF. You're going to be using less malt in your mash. The later additions can maximize flavor, and then maybe consider using hop products that don't that don't contribute to the bitterness units. And there's a lot of products out there. Salvo from Hopsteiners is one of them. Mouthfeel and sweetness, those unfermentable sugars could be produced, not utilized, but they could also be added to increase some mouthfeel and sweetness. There's other products, fiber products, Fibersol is one of them, that could increase some of that texture and remove some of that wateriness if you happen to have that. And again, acidity additions, acid additions here wouldn't really impact the RDF. That would be more in the mash and lautering steps. In your fermenter, consider what yeast you're selecting. So you could go with a traditional yeast. Again, you would need to utilize an arrested or cold contact fermentation, or utilize a non-alc yeast. But trial these yeasts and want to consider them, the phenolics that they may produce, and flavors. And then depending on the yeast used, you need to consider what their optimal fermentation conditions are. So the oxygen requirements, temperature being important, and their pitch rates. Some non-alcoholic strains can be treated like standard yeast in full alcohol beer. So some producers have dried yeast that can be just pitched, just like you would a full strength beer production. And some are pitchable yeast quantities that you would pitch right at time zero when you knock out and send your wort over to the fermenter. Utilizing hops in the fermenter, this is important to understand because your hops may not, your hops may contribute to fermentation load, to contamination load of pathogens, depending on what hop product you use. So if you're using a hop cone, there may be pathogens that you're unaware of that, no fault to anyone, but could lend to adding pathogens into the fermentation. Yeah, so there's different procedures that can be done, such as a hot hop dip, where you are in a separate vessel, you have hot water, you dip your hops in, you extract the flavors, and then you can add that to your fermentation. Or do a partial or full crash cool. Other additions to consider when you're utilizing, when you're producing a low and non-alc beverage is to use ALDC. So if you do add hops in your fermenter, you may need to increase the temperature to do a diacetyl rest, but you may want to consider something like ALDC, which can decrease your time that would be needed to have it at warmer temperatures and thus decrease microbial, the risk of microbial growth. Look into utilizing preservatives, potassium sorbate, sodium benzoate, or Kyber. That would create a bacteriostatic environment. However, if you use these products, they may require labeling. And again, this is another step where acid additions could help. They may also add flavor. So you could consider utilizing citric or malic acid. Those are some options for providing flavor into the product. One thing to consider here, though, is that because you are producing a less alcohol product, a lower alcohol product, there is a chance that when you go to cool your beer at crash temps, you need to keep that temperature above 34 Fahrenheit, because there is a risk that you could freeze your beer, because of course it's a little more watered down. When you're in the fermenter, if you do happen to warm up your fermentation above 70 degrees, this is a note that I'd like to stress where bacteria can thrive. Again, if you have no alcohol, you have a lot of sugar, and you may have a higher pH environment, this is where bacteria could take off. One way to do this is to decrease your risk by decreasing the quantity of additions of hops and therefore not loading the fermentation with microbes. Decrease your contact time as well, specifically hop cones. And then if you can not be in this temperature range for a long time, or cool as soon as possible if you have to get into this warm zone for, say, a diacetyl rest. Cool it down as soon as possible. In your bright tank, this is where you can consider how you're going to add color. You could utilize products like Pure Malt or Cinnamar. Xberry is a non-beer coloring made with natural ingredients. I'll highlight flavors and mouthfeel and sweetness columns together. You'll notice here, this is where you can add a lot of flavoring, but notice that a lot of these are may contain fermentable sugars. If you do utilize these products for a low and non-alcoholic beverage, adding these cold and right before tunnel pasteurization will minimize your microbial risk. If you happen to have them, minimize their ability to utilize these sugars and grow in your final product. Carbonation. You would like to, we recommend carbonating as high as you can, but it's important to understand how high your seams of your packaged product can go. So you need to do a lot of trial and error of carbonation levels, followed by tunnel pasteurization to understand just how high you can carbonate your product. The benefit of carbonating is it would lower the acidity, lower the pH, but you would also have, the carbonation can also help fill the sensory gap that the lack of alcohol creates. So if you don't have an alcohol in your product, the fizziness of the carbonation can replace that. One of the benefits with yeast is so flavors. So what you're trying to do when you're producing a low and non-alcoholic beer is you're trying to associate flavor production with that of a high alcohol full strength beer. Doing that, you can get that from yeast, hops, other additives. What we have at Berkeley Yeast is we have yeast strains that produce flavors. So we ran trials where, compared to a traditional full-strength beer, the yeast produced flavors, and those flavors we had a trained sensory panel and ran trials and found that some of our yeast strains could produce flavors that were preferable and comparable to a full strength beer. So there's again, this is just an example of one of the levers that can be pulled to bring flavor in to mimic a full strength beer. After all this, and I know I just threw a lot out there, but recommendations is test a first batch and then do nothing and ask yourself, how did it go? Your first batch, make it small, and as well, fail small. So you're going to produce, you're going to formulate a recipe, you're going to produce a small batch, and then you're going to pull samples, and you're going to add different flavorings. You're going to do many different things, tinker it, chef it up, and then ask yourself, well, how did it go? And which one you like the most? Do a lot of R&D. Don't do anything, don't add anything to the brine tank until you have done it in the small scale first. And after you have identified what direction you want to go, then you need to test it in a tunnel pasteurization. So then you need to package your product and target a high pasteurization unit up to 100 and test it. You can do this in a water bath. Put it in and see how that flavor may change after pasteurization. At the same time, do contamination testing. So there's many ways that you can go about this. You can do plate tests. You can do PCR tests. You can pull a sample, plate it out. May have to do serial dilutions if you have a high microbial load. You may have to filter your sample and then take the filter paper and put it on a Petri dish to determine what's present and what the risk is. Another option, pull samples and send them off to a third-party service. There's many of these available, private parties, as well as university extension services. And going back to that cartoon at the very beginning, don't let the pathogens survive the gauntlet. So go through your process, be aware and review. I mentioned before, consider consulting with a process authority. Read and understand the current good manufacturing practices. And this is the Code of Federal Regulations. This section here of the CFR talks about what needs to be considered when producing a packaged food product. As mentioned before, test for the microbial contamination. And not only do it in your final product, look at multiple steps in your brewing process. Understand the greatest potential hazards: E. coli 0157H7, Salmonella, Clostridium, E. coli and Salmonella, but be aware of others: Staphylococcus aureus, Clostridium, and please consider having a source for tunnel pasteurization. This is the most robust option. And at the same time, try to acidify down to pH 4 as low as possible. Ideally, you want to do these together. So it's an additive process, a greater than additive effect. And understand that some microorganisms can survive harsh conditions. So even though you're tunnel pasteurizing, are your pasteurization units high enough? Are they long enough? Is the pasteurization long enough to kill these microorganisms? Are your methods bactericidal or bacteriostatic? So flash pasteurization may not kill these pathogens. That's why we recommend tunnel pasteurization. Preservatives and other additives continue to be tested. And the reason I stress this is because we don't want to let history repeat itself. So the CDC estimates that there's 128,000 hospitalizations and 3,000 deaths annually due to foodborne illnesses. Now, yes, many of these occur in exposed products, meats and vegetables grown out in fields, meats from a processing plant, but they can still occur in cans and bottles. That's why tunnel pasteurization is important. I highlight the outbreak from 30 years ago when E. coli showed up in unpasteurized apple juice. It did result in 1 death. And even in a low alcohol, so it was a weak beer, 2.5%, and the pH was over 5.0. And this beer, produced during World War I and II, had contamination, and it made a lot of people sick. It was E. coli. The strain was undetermined, but these are just some of the risks that are involved in producing these products. So for the industry as a whole, craft beer industry, please take note of these risks and consider if you should enter into this if you don't understand the process that you're setting forth, the recipe you're setting forth, the possibility of pathogenic contamination, and how you're going to make a shelf-stable product by tunnel pasteurization and acidification. I'll make this available to you upon request. These are many links to many of the things that I've covered today, namely the references on the right-hand side. So a lot of my talk is based off of these 5 public journal publications, but the links to the USDA, the CFR, as well as publications through the Brewers Association. There was a good one back in January on putting non-alcoholic beer on draft and the risks involved in this. Also, how to identify and detect microorganisms. So a lot of protocols available through the ASBC, and then a link to process authorities through the AFDO. I will end there. I thank you for your time. I'd like to say this was a sobering talk, but at least we're near beer. So thank you, and I will be happy to take any questions.